Vijay Prashad, a renowned author, journalist and political commentator, is a man who needs little introduction. His work on Xinjiang, among other things, has made headlines around the world. And I'm delighted today to welcome him to the show. So Vijay, it's a pleasure to see you.
It's nice to be with you. Thanks for inviting me.
So you've often said that Xinjiang is central to the US Cold War on China. So first of all, can you talk about why and how you believe the US to be in a Cold War with China and exactly how Xinjiang fits into all of this, please?
Well, it's interesting because about almost 15 years ago, the United States came to the realization that the Chinese, the Indians, the Brazilians, and other big countries of the global south had basically begun to trade with each other to create a trade and development project that sidelined Europe and the United States. You know, this was partly institutionalized in the BRICS project in 2009 and partly institutionalized later in the One Belt, One Road project, or later the Belt and Road Project in 2013. This is the reason why US President Obama in 2011 talked about a pivot to China. China was developing rapidly, particularly economic development, but also in technology. You know, in other words, it hadn't immediate economic benefits. China's technological developments were galloping forward. And this directly threatened the accumulation strategies in the United States. In other words, it threatened the big technology companies. And so the United States tried to put pressure on China to basically slow down its development. That's the essence of the new Cold War. It's interesting that in the second Trump administration, he has surrounded himself with people who are realists, you know, whether it's Elrich Colby, who runs his China policy from the US Defense Department, or it's his close advisor, Peter Thiel, the billionaire technology magnate. They equally believe that the threat to the United States is not coming from Iran, it's not coming from Russia, it's coming from China. It's not a military threat. They say it's an economic threat. So to undo this economic threat, they have begun now for 15 years a pressure campaign against China, which we call the new Cold War.
Right. So we've all heard the Western narratives surrounding Xinjiang. Forced labor this, human rights violations that. There's even been claims made of genocide at the highest levels of the US government. Do you put any weight in these claims?
Well, it's interesting because the United States government began a very, very major military campaign in 2001, which it called the War on Terror. First, the United States, with its European allies, attacked Afghanistan, killed unknown numbers of people. We really don't know the body count from Afghanistan. Then the United States illegally attacked Iraq without a UN Security Council mandate. Million people plus, more than 1 million people died in the US illegal war in Iraq. And then, you know, this war on terror spread all across the world. There were dark site prisons in Poland and we don't know where, in Guantanamo Bay and so on. United States government was picking up people off the streets of Italy and disappearing them. It was a very vicious campaign, which, you know, included the destruction of Libya in 2011. This is actually real. This actually happened, you know, and there's been no accountability. The US actually illegally attacked Iraq. There's no need to take my word for it. UN Secretary General Kofi Annan said so to BBC in 2004. He said this war is illegal that the US is prosecuting in Iraq. These things actually happened. Millions of Muslims were killed in these wars of terror conducted by the United States. This is real life, yeah? So it was interesting that as part of the new Cold War pressure on China, that the United States, which had conducted this war on terror in Central Asia, in Afghanistan, in Uzbekistan, in Tajikistan, in Pakistan, and so on, United States suddenly became a defender of Muslims. That was itself a surprise. And then to make allegations about things that it said were happening in Xinjiang, which didn't ever come to the level of the war in Iraq, for instance, over 1 million people dead. Not one US document suggests that 1 million people were killed in Xinjiang. Not one US document. So, what they did actually in real life in Iraq, they sort of transposed in a fabricated way to what was happening in Xinjiang. Now, look, let's be quite clear. In the region of Central Asia, from the 1990s onward, after the fall of the Soviet Union, there was a serious problem with the rise of a kind of militancy, of terrorism, a serious problem in Uzbekistan, Tajikistan, Afghanistan. So did China. There were terrorist attacks in Urumqi. They wanted to deal with the issue of terrorism in a manner that was sustainable and long term, not just a military manner, but through economic development. And the United States is arguing, in a sense, Jamie, and this is what's interesting, that its strategy of killing over 1 million people is somehow more legitimate than economic development. They are calling economic development genocide and worrying about what they call cultural genocide when they are actually inflicting the disappearance of Iraqi people and right now defending completely with complicity the actual genocide of the Palestinians.
We'll get into the genocide that is taking place right now and the claims of genocide that were made against in Xinjiang. But first, I think it's interesting you mentioned about the US's the war on terror, the 20-year plus invasion and occupation of Iraq, Afghanistan, Libya. Now, it's kind of interesting that the same politicians who were leading these wars are now attempting to position themselves as the defenders of human rights, those that care about Muslims in Xinjiang. What's your take?
See, it's interesting. The politicians who do this kind of thing, who do this, they need to go and sit on the couch of a Freudian analyst to try to understand their attempt to transpose their own problems onto somebody else. Okay, they actually participated in the creating of dark sites, prisons, Guantanamo Bay, and so on. They actually participated in this. They supported it. They waved the flag in favor of it. The prisons in Bagram, in Afghanistan, or in Abu Ghraib prison in Iraq, people have forgotten the name Abu Ghraib. These are real prisons which the United States set up to torture people and so on. They then suddenly came up with these reports in the early period of the new Cold War against China to make accusations saying China is doing this in Xinjiang. Now, the evidence for it is so light when one reads those texts. The evidence is light. Now, obviously, something was happening in Xinjiang. Why do we know that? Because the Chinese government, like again the governments of Uzbekistan, Tajikistan, and so on, was trying to deal with an imminent problem. When I was reporting the war in Syria, I met some of the people who were far extremist organizations from the Xinjiang area in Syria. That's the headquarters. It was in Idlib province in Syria. I mean, this is a problem that a government would have to deal with. An organization that believes it's okay to blow up bombs in the center of a civilian area in Urumqi Bazaar and so on. You have to deal with these organizations. You can't be idealists and say they don't exist. They actually exist. But how you deal with them is important. And in a sense, the Chinese position has not been aerial bombardment of Urumqi. China hasn't decided, well, let's destroy the whole central bazaar. It has said that the way to tackle terrorism is through a long-term sustainable process of economic development. And on the one side, you've got to have a process of de-radicalizing people. That's the position. It's a position of peaceful tackling of terrorism, by and large. Much better than going to war against the whole civilization.
Do you think that's why it's all gone quiet on the Western Front in terms of Xinjiang? Because it's hard to make the case of a genocide happening there when there's no armed conflict, there's no bombings, and that yet the world can see every day the pictures of destruction, of famine, of death coming out every day. So is that why we're no longer hearing about the Xinjiang genocide?
Well, let's think about what a genocide is. A genocide is the complete destruction either of a people or of their culture. You know, that's you got to somehow prove that, you know, you don't have to kill everybody in a people, but you have to kill a lot of people. So that was not possible to be made. I mean, there simply isn't mass killing happening in Xinjiang. Well, you could say, okay, no mass killing. What about mass displacement of people? You know, cleansing of people, like what's happening in Gaza, the attempt to remove all the Palestinians from there. Well, there's no evidence of bulldozers coming in and removing the homes of the Uyghur minority and throwing them into any other country and so on. You know, they're not being pushed into Afghanistan or Uzbekistan or Tajikistan. It's just not happening. Yeah. So there's no evidence of that. So then you fall to the third proposition on genocide, which is cultural genocide, saying that, you know, the Uyghur people's culture is being removed. Well, how do you measure that? That is actually a very difficult thing to have a standard for. You say, well, you know, people who are non-Uyghur are moving into this area. That happens all over the world. If that is the standard for genocide, then there is genocide happening everywhere in the world where there's migration, and particularly in migration. You know, you would say, well, you know, in that case, the United States is a country of genocide, because where are the Native Americans? And, you know, what about that? Let's start talking about that again. You know, that's not foundational. So then we come to the issue of economic benefit. Okay, this is interesting. Yes, it's true. There's going to be a lot of expenditure on Xinjiang. There's a major land port created near Urumqi. Xinjiang has the largest solar farm. There's an attempt to upgrade the textile industry in Xinjiang, because, you know, it's the major producer of cotton, but the textile industry was in the eastern coast. There's an attempt to move the textile industry into southern Xinjiang. All of that is happening. So the question is raised, who's benefiting? Are the Uyghur minority benefiting from this? If you start asking those questions, Jamie, then you have to ask the questions of any economic development. You know, who's benefiting? If there's a mining company from Canada operating in Zambia, are the Zambian people benefiting? Yeah, that's now going to be questions about capitalism. Well, actually, interestingly, let's stay on this issue of economic development and benefits. In fact, it's interesting. If you look at the statistics, it looks like the benefits have gone quite broadly to the population in Xinjiang. Xinjiang has had a very successful poverty alleviation campaign. Xinjiang has been very successful in lifting up its economic status in the country. It's one of the fastest growing regions for incomes and so on. So where is the evidence of a genocide? You know, okay, then you say the de-radicalization project is a problem. Well, look, firstly, they are not dead. The people who were being, taught about a gentler form of Islam and so on, they were not being killed off they were not, yes, children thrown in camps and just made to spend their life there like the United States did in Guantanamo. I mean, there are places where people are being taught this is a gentler form of Islam. This is, not a good interpretation. That's a legitimate form of debate and discussion for any government to have. Okay. Now, you may not agree with their interpretation of Islam or whatnot. Have a debate and discussion. That's open. But to call that a genocide, I think is going very far, because if that is a genocide and you're not willing to call what's happening in Palestine a genocide, then we've got a problem with the English language.
Absolutely, and just to play devil's advocate, you mentioned about you cite the economic development of the region. Some may argue that the US done very well during slavery. That its economic development was founded on the backs of those people that were enslaved and oppressed. So how can we be sure exactly that the region's development is not based on forced labor or anything around that?
Well, firstly, in the cotton textile industry, forced labor would be today highly, highly inefficient. Most cotton industry is mechanized. I mean, don't again take my word for it. If somebody in the United States actually interested in, they should make a trip to the headquarters of the John Deere Corporation and go and ask John Deere about the export of farming equipment to southern Xinjiang in the Xinjiang Uyghur Autonomous Region. And John Deere will have to tell you, yes, we've exported so many harvesters and so many this and so many that, because when you go to southern Xinjiang, you see the John Deere products there working the fields. This is not the 18th and 19th century. In the 21st century, most of this kind of industry, cotton and other products that go into textile, are mechanized. Even the production of textiles is mechanized. So you can ask a different question, Jamie, which is not forced labor, which is unemployment. Which is people getting displaced by machinery. I think that's a very important question. Are they being displaced? Well, yes, they are being displaced. They are no longer working long hours in the fields. The question is, how will they improve their own economic prospects? I think that comes to the heart of a challenge all of China is facing. As China is moving to the new quality productive forces, the question is going to be raised, well, what do you do with the hundreds of millions of people who are no longer working in agricultural farms that are mechanized? What are you going to do with them? Well, we'll see what the discussions in China are around 2049, after the 100th year of the Chinese Revolution. But this is a broad social problem. This is not a Xinjiang problem or a southern Xinjiang problem. This is going to be a real discussion and debate around what do the new quality productive forces mean for society.
So in this discussion, I've spoken to a lot of people, and they say, like yourself, you point out the hypocrisy between a country that has taken the actions that it's taken over the past couple of decades against Muslim populations and countries, and what is happening in Xinjiang right now. I've been told that it's less about the people and more about it's the region, the location, the geopolitics. Xinjiang, many people don't know, is the largest province in China. It's the land bridge which connects East Asia with Europe and Central Asia. So how important is its value in terms of geopolitics weighing in on this discussion?
Well, look, from the standpoint of Beijing, I think there was a real recognition, and geopolitics, I don't think, is actually leading the issue here. I think there was a sense that, look, Xinjiang is part of China, and we can't neglect the western part of China, that it has to be properly integrated. And that was the essence of Go West. Then the question of the chaos in Central Asia was very much in the minds of people. But this third one is important. Of course, the geopolitics is important, but it's becoming less the central issue. And why it's becoming less the central issue is that it was an issue when Russia and China didn't have a border agreement, when Russia and China were not so close. Now, in 2022, after Russia and China signed the No Limits Partnership, they are actually working together in the Central Asian states and so on. I don't think that issue of Eurasian tensions is on the table. Now it's some mischief that comes from Western countries. Frankly, if I'm totally frank, there were all kinds of historical problems that were there in Eurasia, between Turkey, Russia, China. These have been sorted out. Turkey, Russia, China, Iran are all working together through the Shanghai Cooperation Organization to bring peace in the region. I don't think they have an interest in mischievously intervening in each other's affairs. I don't think that's the problem. I think this is a particular malignancy of the West trying to utilize its control over world communication systems to drive, to do a kind of reputation damage on China. I think that's really what's happening. So it's not that any of the regional powers are, fooling around here. I think the United States thought that it had found a vulnerability and tried to exploit the vulnerability. And frankly, if they had seen this vulnerability in Mongolia or in Kunming, they would have gone and tried it there. I think that's what really motivated the US. It was less about Xinjiang and more about, there's a vulnerability, let's pick the scab.
You've mentioned that this is an information warfare, that this is narrative control, but you've also gone a step further and you've said far from the US actually trying to assist or help anybody in the region, that it's actually trying to light the match of Islamic extremism. Could you just elaborate on that point?
Well, let's go back a little bit, for that point. When the 1978 SAW revolution took place in Afghanistan, when the Afghanistan left and democratic forces came to power in Kabul, the United States saw that the principal oppositions, two of them, to the SAW revolution were on the one side the liberals, which, they had a constitutional problem with what had happened in the SAW revolution, and they were a minor political force. They had backed the king. But the other side were the radical Islamists, who had coalesced around the Jamaat-e-Islami forces, and had been quite vicious. I mean, Gulbuddin Hekmatyar, as a student, made his name throwing acid in the face of women students, And the US picked these characters and backed them to the hilt to start doing militant operations against literacy campaigns in Afghanistan. I'm talking about now 1978, 1979. This group was then fashioned as the Mujahideen, the army of God, and the United States, through the CIA and the Pakistani military, funded them and created the chaos in Afghanistan. And this is what the US basically was trying to do in Xinjiang, was to try to ally with forces just like the pre-Taliban forces in Afghanistan and create a problem inside Xinjiang province. It hasn't worked. It hasn't worked out because I think the Chinese government didn't fall for the trap of making this a military solution. Instead, the Chinese government has gone for an economic solution, to go to the material base of the people's grievances to solve that, rather than just bomb the cities. And I think that was, that took a lot of maturity for the Chinese government to do, because it would have been so easy to have just gone in and leveled a couple of neighborhoods and said, well, you're doing this, in Afghanistan, or the Russians did this in Chechnya. We are just following the script. But the Chinese didn't. And I think that's really why there's something to learn about what has happened in the Uyghur regions. There's something to learn there. And I think this is something that's going to be hard for people to learn, because even listening to you and me talk right now, some people will get an allergic reaction and say, oh, they are genocide deniers. But why not study this and try to learn from it, rather than have an allergic reaction to something that doesn't sound like the Western, communication warfare against parts of the global South.
That's it. You throw so much mud at the wall, and some of it sticks. But I think we're out of time. Vijay, I could talk about this all day with you. Thank you so much for your time. Thank you for being on the show.
Yeah, thanks a lot.
Thank you.